The $6 bolt sat in Garrett Nolan's open hand when Renée Dufour walked onto the inspection platform and told the federal observers, the site engineers, and the 2 journalists she had personally invited to witness the occasion that a maintenance-level inspector had just stopped an $820 million infrastructure project over a piece of hardware she could source in bulk from any supply counter in the province. She took the red hold tag from the load-bearing assembly herself, tore it loose with one firm pull, and fired Garrett Nolan in front of everyone present on that catwalk. Garrett did not argue. He sealed the bolt in a labeled evidence sleeve, recorded the time, added his signature, and walked toward the site exit for the last time as a Dufour Infrastructure employee. He had worked that bridge since the first concrete was poured, 11 years in total with the company. He left the way he had always moved through a worksite, without hurry, without drama, his eyes steady and forward. 3 days later, under static load testing in a controlled laboratory environment, a bolt drawn from the same batch sheared clean through a test fixture. By the end of that week, the $820 million North Reach Corridor contract, the project Renée Dufour had spent 4 years calling the most significant infrastructure achievement in the company's history, was placed under federal suspension, and nobody at Dufour Infrastructure Group could explain to Infrastructure Canada why, in any way that held together for longer than 5 minutes. Before that $6 bolt brings down an $820 million empire, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single moment of what happened next. Dufour Infrastructure Group had built its reputation across 3 decades of bridge work in British Columbia and Alberta, starting with rural highway crossings and working upward through increasingly complex spans until it landed, 4 years ago, the contract that changed everything. The North Reach Corridor was a 340-meter suspension bridge over the Clearwater River Gorge in northern British Columbia, part of a federal commitment to provide year-round road access to 3 First Nations communities that had spent generations depending on a seasonal ice bridge that closed entirely in spring and during storm warnings. The federal contract was worth $820 million, the largest in the company's history, and it carried a completion clause tied to a specific handover date. Every week past that date cost Dufour Infrastructure a penalty that Renée Dufour, the company's chief executive, had made clear she intended never to pay. The day of Garrett's firing, the project had been 14 months from completion. The critical structural connections on the main tower were being finished, and a delegation from Infrastructure Canada's Oversight Division, along with representatives from the 3 communities the bridge was built to serve, had flown in to observe the final inspection phase before the cable tensioning sequence began. It was the most visible day Renée Dufour had scheduled all year, and she had arranged for print and broadcast media to attend. Garrett Nolan had worked quality inspection at Dufour Infrastructure for 8 years, which was why almost nobody on the active site crew knew that he had spent the 12 years before that as a structural engineer specializing in cable-supported bridge connections. He had helped design the load transfer system used in the very tower assembly he was now inspecting. After his wife, Caroline, died suddenly from an undetected cardiac condition. When their daughter Tessa was 9 years old, Garrett had stepped away from project leadership. He took a site inspection role, consistent hours, stable schedule, no extended travel, so that he could be home when Tessa came through the door each afternoon. The management team that came in during his transition only ever looked at his job classification. Not one of them had ever asked why a man with his technical background had chosen to stay. His rule, the one that had never shifted in all the years since, was straightforward. A component does not become safe because someone with a higher title decides it is. During his final pre-tension inspection of the main tower's base flange connection, Garrett noticed something wrong with a batch of structural bolts seated in the primary load transfer ring. The head markings were correct at a distance, but the surface finish under direct light had a slightly different quality than the CSA G40.21 specification required. He pulled 3 bolts from different positions, cross-referenced their batch codes against the Certified Materials Register, and found that none of the codes appeared anywhere in the project's approved supplier documentation. In the materials storage container near the site office, he found the original packaging. Commercial-grade structural bolts, manufactured to a general industrial standard rather than to the Canadian Highway Bridge Design Code, available through any trade supply distributor. The unit price difference was right there on the packing label, $6.40 per bolt, compared to the $84 certified equivalent the design specification required. There were 1,400 of them installed across the tower base connections. Garrett placed a red hold tag on the assembly and stopped the inspection sequence. His site supervisor told him, without any softening of the message, that halting the inspection at this stage would push the federal delegation's visit past the afternoon flight window and would, in all likelihood, cause the milestone payment to be withheld. Garrett told him that the milestone payment had no effect on the shear load tolerance of a non-certified fastener. He checked the procurement records next. The same commercial hardware had been entering the approved materials stream for 7 months. He had no way to know yet how many connections across the entire structure it had already reached. He had seen procurement substitutions before. He had spent 12 years in the field before moving to inspection, and he understood how pressure worked on a site running behind schedule. What he also understood, in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has never spent years designing connections rather than just installing them, is that a bridge does not fail because of a single catastrophic error. It fails because a series of small decisions, each one made by someone confident that someone else will catch it, accumulate until the margin disappears entirely. The bolt in his hand was not evidence of sabotage. It was evidence of a calculation, cheaper, faster to source, visually indistinguishable from the certified part, and therefore easy to wave past an inspection that everyone assumed was a formality. He photographed the packaging, documented the batch codes, cross-referenced the delivery dates against the timeline, showing when the approved supplier had been delayed by a 6-week backlog, and had the full written record ready before he brought the hold tag upstairs. He had learned, early in his career, that an undocumented concern was just an opinion, and opinions disappeared quickly in rooms where people had considerably more at stake than he did. Renée Dufour came down from the executive trailer within 8 minutes of hearing that her flagship project had been stopped. She stepped onto the catwalk and looked first at the red tag hanging from the tower base assembly. She asked, without greeting anyone, who had made the decision to halt the sequence. Garrett explained the difference between the installed bolts and the design specification, the grade, the load tolerances, the fatigue rating under dynamic wind load and thermal cycling, and the traceability documentation that the federal contract required for every certified structural fastener. He offered her the written comparison he had already prepared. Renée did not take the folder. She asked how much the bolt in his hand had cost. When Garrett told her the unit price was approximately $6, she laughed, an actual audible laugh, in front of the federal delegation, the community representatives, and the 2 journalists she had brought to witness what was supposed to be a positive milestone. Miles Hatfield, the chief operating officer standing 2 steps behind her, announced to the gathered observers that the company's senior quality inspector had placed an $820 million federal project on hold over hardware available at any trade counter in the country. Renée asked Garrett whether he understood what a single day of delay cost the company in real dollar terms. Garrett told her that penalty costs did not alter the fatigue behavior of a non-certified alloy under sustained cable tension load. That answer, offered without any change in his tone or posture, appeared to land on her as a direct challenge to her authority, in front of the exact audience she had arranged to impress. She called him a maintenance inspector who had mistaken a component database for an engineering degree. Miles mentioned, almost as an aside, that Garrett was a single parent who depended on this position, as though that fact ought to make him easier to redirect. Renée told him to sign the inspection release so the sequence could continue. He refused. She reached forward, removed the red hold tag from the assembly herself, and terminated Garrett Nolan's employment on the spot, in front of the entire gathering. Two of the younger site technicians nearby looked at each other but said nothing. An older ironworker, who had worked alongside Garrett for 4 years, looked away. He was not the kind of man who showed discomfort on his face, but anyone paying attention could see it. Garrett's site access card was deactivated before he reached the equipment compound gate. Another inspector was instructed to sign the release in his place. Garrett did not raise his voice or ask for an appeal. He asked only that the hold tag removal and his refusal to authorize the inspection release be formally noted in the project record. Miles Hatfield declined to put anything in writing. Before he left the site, Garrett sealed the non-certified bolt in a signed evidence sleeve and filed his full report through the Federal Contract Oversight Submission Channel, not through Dufour Infrastructure's internal system. Within the hour, someone inside the company had quietly reclassified that report from a structural safety concern to a routine documentation query. Garrett had already received the time-stamped confirmation copy at his personal email address before his access was cut. Miles gave a quiet instruction to the replacement inspector: pull a bolt from the same batch already on site, seat it in the flagged position, and bring the inspection sequence back online before the delegation's afternoon flight. That evening, Garrett sat in the kitchen of his house in Prince George and tried to work out how to explain to his daughter what had happened that day. Tessa was 21 now, a second-year civil engineering student at the University of Waterloo on a co-op placement term, and she called him during her dinner break. After she noticed his site check-in had gone quiet on the family location app they both still used out of habit, he told her there had been a disagreement about a component specification. Tessa, who had grown up watching him bring inspection manuals home the way other fathers brought work laptops, said that measurement did not change because the person looking at it wanted a different number. She asked if he needed her to come home. He told her he would be fine. The truth was that he had been sitting at the kitchen table for the past hour, with the termination paperwork in front of him and a very clear understanding that somewhere on that bridge, 400 bolts were installed in positions the design specification explicitly required to carry a different fastener, and that no title, no delivery schedule, and no federal milestone payment changed that by a single newton of load capacity. He thought about the years he had spent as an engineer designing exactly this kind of connection: the load calculations, the fatigue model, the safety margins that always seemed excessive right up until the moment they were not. He was not afraid of being wrong about the bolt. He was afraid of what being wrong about being wrong would eventually mean, hundreds of meters above a river, in the dark of a northern winter. Before he set down the phone, Tessa said, with the kind of directness she had always gotten from her mother, that in 21 years she had never once seen him misread a number that mattered. She did not expect that to have changed today. Garrett checked the copy of his inspection report that had been routed to his personal address before his account was closed and found that the severity classification, the timestamp, and the name listed under the approving authority had all been quietly altered in the version visible through the project portal. His copy still showed the original. Inside the Dufour Infrastructure site office, Vivian Rast, the lead structural engineer on the North Reach project, knew that signing off on the inspection without addressing the bolt specification was wrong. She had known it before Garrett ever filed his report. Renée had made it clear to her, in a private conversation 2 weeks earlier, that if the Northreach project missed its completion milestone due to a materials delay, the engineering team had failed to flag early enough, Vivian would carry the professional consequences of that failure personally. She had stayed quiet on the catwalk when Garrett was fired. That night, she pulled the original design file and confirmed what she had already suspected. The connection specification called for the CSA-grade fastener, and the engineer who had written that specification 9 years earlier, during the original design phase, was Garrett Nolan. She sat with that information for a long time. The load-bearing test sequence restarted the following morning. By midday, the federal delegation had departed, and the site appeared to be proceeding normally. But at 4:18 in the afternoon, during a static load simulation in the materials testing laboratory, where samples from the tower connection had been sent for parallel verification, one of the bolts, drawn from the same batch, sheared under a load level that the certified specification was rated to hold at twice the margin. The fracture surface was not irregular or anomalous. It was exactly what a fatigue mode failure looked like, when a commercial-grade fastener was subjected to the rated load of a structural-grade specification. Liam Broder, the laboratory supervisor who had been running the test, sealed the failed bolt in an evidence container, backed up the full data run to a second server, and called Garrett Nolan's personal number before anyone else in the building knew the test had stopped. Miles Hatfield arrived at the lab within the hour and told Liam that the incident was to be entered in the project log as a testing equipment calibration anomaly. Liam asked in writing on the official project log whether Miles was authorizing a materials failure to be reclassified as equipment error. Miles told him to stop generating documentation. By that time, the external oversight report Garrett had filed before leaving the site had been reviewed by the Federal Contract Monitoring Office, the senior auditor assigned to the Northreach file, a methodical, unhurried woman named Janet Lim, who had spent 16 years reviewing infrastructure contracts for Infrastructure Canada, had placed a hold on all further structural connection work pending an on-site inspection. Renée Dufour assumed, when Janet Lim's office called, that this was a procedural inquiry she could manage through the company's standard compliance channel. She was wrong about that. Janet arrived at the Northreach site the following morning with an independent audit team. Renée met her in the site office and described the failed laboratory bolt as an isolated sample anomaly with no connection to the installed structure. Janet asked to see the failed bolt, the original purchase order for the fastener batch currently installed in the tower connections, and the inspection release form signed on the day of Garrett's termination. The 3 documents contained inconsistencies in the batch identification codes that could not be explained by any single administrative error. Liam Broder handed Janet the full data package from the materials test, the load curve showing the failure point, and the timing log proving the failure had been a gradual fatigue event rather than a sudden calibration spike. Renée tried to redirect the conversation toward Garrett's departure, describing him as a disgruntled former employee who had filed an unsubstantiated concern as an act of professional grievance before clearing out. Janet responded by asking Garrett to return to the site and walk her team through the original inspection. He came back through the same gate where his access card had been deactivated 4 days earlier. Renée had him seated at the far end of the conference table and introduced him to the room as a former employee recently separated from the company, a framing she clearly intended to make his contribution seem peripheral. Garrett placed the $6 commercial bolt on the table beside the CSA-certified equivalent he had kept in his jacket pocket since the day he was fired. The 2 bolts looked nearly identical. He explained, without raising his voice, exactly where they differed: alloy composition, proof load rating, surface treatment for environmental exposure, fatigue tolerance under cyclic loading, and the material certification chain that federal bridge standards required for every safety-critical fastener. He set a copy of the specification document beside the two bolts and did not add anything further. Janet's team inspected the materials storage compound and found more than 2,200 commercial-grade bolts mixed into the certified inventory bins, many of them retagged with documentation that did not match the actual unit specifications. Perry Vanek, the procurement director, insisted the substitution had been initiated by a single purchasing assistant acting without authorization. The procurement records, once Janet's team accessed the server archive, showed Perry Vanek's own approval signature on the original order placed with the discount industrial distributor. Renée continued to insist that no one in senior leadership had known the substitution was occurring at that scale. Janet then asked, in front of the assembled room, who had authored the original structural fastener specification for the Northreach connection assembly. It was Vivienne Rast who answered. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. She said the name clearly enough that everyone in the room heard it. Garrett Nolan. The room absorbed that in complete silence. The people who had dismissed the man in the worn field jacket and the dusty work boots now understood that they had terminated the engineer who had written the safety standard their company had just violated on an $820 million federal project. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was something heavier than awkwardness. A junior auditor on Janet's team pulled up an archived design review report from 9 years earlier, buried in a project file that had not been opened since the original design phase. It contained Garrett's engineering stamp, a structural analysis of a connection failure mode under dynamic load, and a written recommendation that read almost word for word like the concern he had raised 4 days ago. He had identified the same failure mechanism during prototype testing, before the design was finalized, and before the contract was even tendered. The specification now being violated was one he had written specifically to prevent the failure that had just occurred in Liam's laboratory. Renée attempted to suggest that historical documentation had limited relevance to a current procurement dispute. Hugh Callister, the board chairman who had been listening from the far end of the table without speaking, set down his pen. The structural inspection of the installed work found commercial-grade fasteners at multiple load-bearing positions across the tower base and the main pylon anchorage points. Not only the section Garrett had tagged before his termination. In total, 1,780 non-certified fasteners were found at positions the design specification had designated as safety critical. Not all of them were guaranteed to fail at design load, but without certified material documentation, not one of them could be verified as safe. The distinction was one that engineers understood, and that executives who had never worked with load calculations sometimes did not. The absence of a visible failure was not proof of adequate safety margin. Janet issued a work suspension order on all structural connections, pending full independent material verification. Infrastructure Canada placed the first scheduled milestone payment on hold. Dufour Infrastructure's share price fell sharply when news of the suspension reached analysts before the close of business. Renée continued, in public statements, to describe the situation as an isolated procurement irregularity being proactively addressed by the company's quality management team. The mood on the site shifted. Workers who had watched Garrett walk out through the gate now sat in the lunch trailers talking quietly about what they had signed off on without realizing it. Several of the trades crew who had worked alongside him for years began telling newer hires what they remembered, that he was the kind of man who would stop a pour over a 2mm discrepancy in rebar placement, if the drawing called for something different, that he had never in 8 years signed his name to something he had not personally verified, and that the quiet, unhurried way he moved through an inspection had always made the job feel like it meant something. A procurement record that Garrett identified from his personal copy of the project documentation contained a handwritten notation approving the use of a commercially equivalent fastener to protect the delivery timeline. The first signature on that notation was Miles Hatfield's. Renée Dufour's electronic countersignature appeared directly below it. She argued that her countersignature had authorized a budget line adjustment, not a technical specification change. Janet's team then produced an internal email thread in which Vivian Rast had explicitly written to both Renée and Miles warning that no fatigue load evaluation had been conducted on the substitute fastener. Renée's reply to that warning, recovered from the company's own server backup, stated that Dufour Infrastructure could not delay an $820 million milestone over what she called distinctions that existed only in the specification margin. Vivian admitted in the audit room that she had stayed dead silent out of fear. She used that word directly, and several board members, who had assumed the engineering team operated with full professional independence, visibly reconsidered what they thought they knew about how the project had been managed. She also produced documentation, proving that Garrett had flagged a nearly identical substitution risk during the original design review, that his recommendation had been formally incorporated into the project specification, and that the standard now being violated was one he had written in response to a fatigue failure he had personally analyzed years before anyone thought to give him credit for it. Renée had spent 4 years publicly describing the Northreach Bridge as a symbol of the company's engineering excellence. She had never, in any of those years, asked whose work that reputation had actually been built on. Hugh Callister convened an emergency board session. Renée asked Garrett to attend and to tell the board that the structural risk could be contained without abandoning the project timeline. Garrett agreed to come. He did not agree to any particular conclusion in advance. On his way out of the site that evening, several members of the crew who had watched him walked to the gate without saying a word, now nodded to him in the compound yard. He nodded back and kept moving. He understood that a nod in a yard was not the same as accountability in a boardroom, and that what still needed to happen would not be resolved by either. Before the board session, Miles Hatfield found Garrett alone in a corridor outside the conference room and offered him reinstatement, a raise, and the newly created title of Director of Structural Quality, on the condition that Garrett described the failed laboratory bolt publicly as a vendor defect unrelated to any management decision, and confirm that the installed fasteners posed no measurable safety concern. Garrett asked what the plan was for the 1,780 non-certified bolts currently sitting in the tower connections. Miles told him they would be replaced on a rolling schedule after the milestone payment had been received and the contract continuation was secured. Garrett said no. He told Miles that a title with his name on it meant nothing if it required him to sign his name to a statement he knew to be false. Miles suggested that no one outside that corridor would ever know the actual basis for the position change, and that the replacements could be completed before any independent inspection returned to the structure. Garrett told him that quiet replacement after contract signature was exactly the plan that had already produced a failed laboratory bolt and a federal work suspension. Repeating the same approach more carefully was still the same approach. Renée arrived shortly after and tried her own version of the conversation. She reminded him that if the Northreach contract collapsed entirely, hundreds of workers, tradespeople, engineers, support staff, would be affected through no fault of their own. Garrett told her that the workers on that site had been placed in an impossible position the moment the company chose to conceal a known specification deviation rather than correct it. She mentioned his circumstances as a single father. She suggested he consider his daughter's future before making a decision that could foreclose his career entirely. He told her that Tessa needed a father who told the truth considerably, more than she needed one who had been paid to certify something false. And that no raise had ever been large enough to make the second version of himself someone his daughter could fully rely on. The full board hearing was attended by Infrastructure Canada representatives, legal counsel for the federal contract, and all active board members. Renée appeared with a legal team and delivered an opening statement describing the situation as a vendor compliance failure that the company's internal processes had already begun to address. Janet Lim laid out the complete timeline without embellishment. The approved supplier had been delayed by a backlog. Miles had approved a commercial substitute to protect the schedule. Vivian had issued a written warning about the missing fatigue evaluation. Renée had approved continued installation anyway. Garrett had discovered the substitution and been fired for refusing to authorize it. His report had been altered within hours of his termination. The bolt had failed under load testing exactly as the original specification predicted. Management had then attempted to have the failure recorded as a calibration anomaly. Liam Broder confirmed under questioning that he had been directly instructed to log the failure as equipment error and to delete the original data run. Perry Vanek admitted that he had retagged boxes of commercial fasteners at Miles Hatfield's explicit direction. Miles, facing the full weight of the document record, began attributing the decisions to Renée. Renée turned immediately and placed the operational responsibility back on Miles alone. Hugh Callister asked her directly why she had fired Garrett on the spot, if she genuinely had not understood the significance of what he had found. She had no answer that did not amount to a confirmation that she had understood clearly and chosen to proceed regardless. The Infrastructure Canada representative stated that the federal contract required the integrity of the entire quality management system, not merely the performance of individual components. Falsified certification documents invalidated the entire project record, regardless of how many individual bolts might still be performing within tolerance. An expanded inspection then identified non-certified fasteners at load-bearing positions in 2 additional provincial projects under Dufour Infrastructure's active portfolio, both tracing to the same commercial distributor, both substituted during periods when the certified supplier had experienced delivery delays. The pattern made it impossible for Renée to continue describing the Northreach deviation as an isolated incident, and her own legal counsel privately recommended she stop making public statements that contradicted the paper trail still being assembled. The federal ruling came the following morning. The Northreach corridor contract was terminated. Dufour Infrastructure was disqualified from the rebid process. All project certifications would require full independent review before any future federal eligibility could be considered. The falsified documentation was referred to federal contract fraud investigators for further review. The decision rested not on the failure of a single bolt, but on the total collapse of the system meant to ensure that every bolt, in every position, could be verified as safe before a family drove across it. Renée Dufour lost the contract she had once called the defining achievement of her career. The company's valuation dropped within hours. Hugh Callister demanded her resignation that afternoon. She pushed back, but by evening the board had voted to remove her, and she was suspended pending the ongoing federal review. Miles and Perry were terminated outright. Both retained separate legal counsel before the week was out. Vivian Rast resigned voluntarily, stating publicly that her silence had made her complicit in something she could no longer defend. She repeated almost the same words, months later, at an engineering ethics seminar at the University of British Columbia, in front of a room full of students who would carry the memory of what she said into their own careers. As the hearing room began to clear, Renée looked at Garrett and asked whether he felt he had won something. He told her that nobody wins when the people who pay the price are the ones who showed up every day and did their jobs in good faith. He picked up the $6 bolt from the table and said, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, that the company had not lost $820 million because of a fastener. It had lost everything because the people responsible for the structure had decided that one person's concern was too small to be worth listening to. There was no applause, only the kind of silence that accumulates when a room full of people all understand, at the same moment, that something important has just been said without any performance attached to it. In the weeks that followed, the board offered Garrett the position of Vice President of Quality Assurance. He took several days before he answered, and when he did, he declined. He told Hugh Callister that replacing one executive with unchecked authority with another person holding the same unchecked authority was not a structural repair. It was simply new material installed in an old defect. He agreed instead to build an independent site integrity office that reported directly to the board, with the authority to halt work on its own technical judgment, to submit safety concerns directly to government clients without executive filtering, and to protect any worker who raised a documented concern from any form of retaliation. The company was permitted to continue its private sector work once the restructuring had been independently verified. At its own cost, Dufour Infrastructure replaced all 1,780 non-certified fasteners identified across its active projects. Because the failure had been caught in a controlled laboratory setting rather than in the field. Because no structure had ever been placed into service carrying those bolts. Not a single completed bridge was compromised, and not a single vehicle crossed a span with a connection it could not trust. The recall was expensive and slow, but Hugh Callister later told shareholders that the cost of doing it correctly was still considerably less than the cost of doing it wrong even once, with a completed structure standing over a river gorge and families crossing it in the dark. Garrett walked back through the Northreach site gate 7 months later, wearing the same field jacket he had always worn, having chosen a hands-on inspection role over any office with a window view. Tessa was finishing her co-op term and drove up from Waterloo for the weekend of the new site safety center opening. She only stayed for a few hours, but anyone who saw her face when she stopped in front of the framed design specification on the wall, the original one, bearing her father's engineering stamp in the lower right corner, understood something about what those hours meant. Liam Brodeur was promoted to lead the new independent testing division. Vivian Rast returned in an advisory capacity, having accepted publicly and in specific terms that her silence had cost more than she had been willing to calculate at the time. Renée Dufour appeared at a public shareholder meeting 8 months after her removal and acknowledged that she had dismissed Garrett's report because of his job title and his circumstances rather than because of any inadequacy in what he had actually found. She was not reinstated. Several of the longer-serving board members noted privately that the admission carried more weight than the many weeks of public statements that had preceded it. On the Northreach site, when a junior inspector 2 years into the role flagged an anomalous surface finish on a shipment of bearing plate hardware, the section supervisor did not suggest they were running behind schedule. The crew stopped work without being asked twice. Garrett came over when he heard, examined the flagged parts under a loop against the reference specification, and confirmed after 2 careful checks that the parts fell within an acceptable manufacturing variation rather than presenting any specification concern. The line restarted within the hour, and not one person on that crew complained about the time it had taken. Because by then, everyone on the Northreach site had learned, in the most direct way possible, exactly what happens when a small concern gets waved through by someone with more to lose from the delay than from the risk. Garrett placed the original $6 commercial bolt in a sealed display case at the entrance to the site safety office. Beneath it, he had a short line engraved on a steel plate, because steel was appropriate for a bridge project and because brevity was how he had always preferred to communicate. It read, A structure is only as strong as the willingness of the people who built it to say when something is wrong. He never gave interviews. He never asked for the case to be installed in a more prominent location. He spent his days walking the same inspection routes he had always walked, checking the same kinds of connections he had first learned to design more than 20 years before anyone thought to put his name on a plate. Tessa called on a Sunday evening a few months after the opening and asked him, the way she had asked several times since the hearing, whether he ever regretted refusing what Miles had offered him that day in the empty corridor. He gave her the same answer he always gave, that the version of himself who had signed that agreement would have been someone she could no longer fully trust, and that no pay grade, no title, and no amount of job security had ever been worth becoming that.